Chapter 5 video lecture. The title of this chapter is Development and Aging of Body Systems. As we go through this discussion, I want you to keep in mind that this course is really guided by Newell's model of constraints. The particular constraint that's related directly to this discussion are the individual constraints, specifically the structural constraints. So keep in mind, so going into the next chapter, we're going to start talking about the development of movements. But just keep in mind that in order to move, the body systems have to work. They have to reach a critical level. And what that means is, in order for, a muscle to contract, it obviously has to be attached to a bone. I mean, hopefully you guys understand that by now. And we'll talk more about that today, or in this discussion. But in order for the muscle to really pull on the bone has to be strong enough to withstand that force. In other words, or else the movement won't occur. Okay. So that's just a basic concept of the individual constraint, or at least a structural constraint. Now, when we look more general in terms of specific movements, like I use the example of shooting a basketball because I say most people are familiar with shooting a basketball. I'm not saying that everyone has the ability to shoot the ball at a proficient level like a collegiate or an NBA basketball player will. But everybody understands that, the first time you pick up the ball, whenever you're a small child, in order to complete the task, you have to use whatever resources you have at the time. And at a young age, you just simply don't have the strength or the structure in order to shoot the ball the same way a collegiate basketball player would. So if you might imagine watching a collegiate basketball player who's been playing his entire life and who has the strength and the size to shoot the ball efficiently and effectively, then you will understand that his form is a lot different than someone who's shooting at maybe 3 or 4 years old trying to accomplish the same task. They don't have the strength, so their movement is more from the hip, trying to get their entire body into the movement. Now, that's just an example of a movement that's affected by the structure of the body. And really, when we start looking at specific, at other movements, I mean, every movement pretty much is the same thing, or it has the same concepts that, we don't really perform proficiently at either a younger age or at the first, when we're first getting used or getting exposed or introduced to particular movements. It either takes time for us to understand how to use our body and to ensure that our body's strong enough to perform the movement correctly and proficiently, or it takes some time to functionally get used to understanding your body. And again, thinking back in the previous chapter, where the first couple of times you do something, your body instinctually is cautious. It doesn't want to fail. It doesn't want to fall. It doesn't want to hurt itself. But once it establishes enough confidence that it could perform the particular movement with efficiency, then that fear goes away and confidence sets in. So, someone who's shooting a ball proficiently, like in basketball, or if they're running a race, the first time they run, it might not be as forceful because they don't understand how to use their body. But once they establish confidence, they can run with a lot of force, then they can pick up speed and improve their form. And that's the same thing, again, with any type of movement. So whatever movement you're involved with, the first time you do it, either, structurally you're not, your body's not prepared to perform at a proficient level, or functionally you just don't have the confidence yet to perform at a proficient level. So we will focus this entire discussion on really, the individual constraints. Okay. So that's pretty much what this slide says, is that, in order to execute a task, we have to understand that several body systems interact in order for us to engage in that particular movement fully and proficiently. So we're going to discuss a lot about we're going to discuss normal development of particular parts of the body, primarily the skeletal system, the cardiovascular system. The muscular system. And then we'll talk about some accessory systems of the nervous system. We'll talk about some accessory systems that are also necessary in order for us to move. Okay. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I just said. All right, so we'll start off with the development of the skeletal system. All right, so this is obviously the framework of the body, and it helps us to protect our body, but it's also responsible for anchoring our functional system. You know, in order for us to move, our muscles, which are responsible for movement, whenever they contract, they have to be able to pull against you know, the anchors of the body, and that's pretty much what the framework of the skeletal system does. There's 206 bones in the body. You learn those in A&P, and perhaps you'll learn them in other classes. Skeletal system, or the bone itself, is living tissue. It does have a cardiovascular supply. It does receive nutrients. It undergoes change throughout the lifetime. So it's a living, you know, viable system. Upon development, our nervous system actually starts off as a cartilaginous model. So whenever we're conceived, and the fetus or the embryo and the fetus, they begin forming. Eventually, cells differentiate to form a system of skeletal cells. So at first, all cells are, you know, very general in nature, but you know, every cell has a particular DNA, and eventually the DNA tells the genetic material eventually tells particular cells, okay, you're going to differentiate into skeletal cells, or you're going to differentiate into muscular cells, or cardiovascular, cardiac cells, or nervous cells, or whatever, you know, whatever the eventual, the final destination will be. So in this case, in the skeletal system, the cells differentiate into the cells, the cartilaginous tissue, or the cartilaginous model that eventually will become the skeletal system. Okay, so we start off as cartilage, and in fact, there's still lots of cartilage even after birth. Now, you can see here that bone formation starts about 2 months after conception. So we start to form bone before we're born, but even after we're born, there's still, you know, several years, I mean, up into our 20s and perhaps even sometimes our 30s, in which bone is still forming. Okay, so that means that cartilage is still present in our body. It's just that, you know, eventually bone replaces all the cartilage that's in the body, or at least part of the skeletal model. Okay, this bone formation that forms from cartilage is known as ossification. And we have two ossification centers in every bone. We have the primary ossification center, and then we have the secondary ossification center. Okay, so ossification, again, is just the formation of bone from cartilage. Okay, when we look at the formation of bone, typically we look at long bones. Now we can look at flat bones and sesamoid bones and other types of bones, but really the easiest way to learn about the bone formation is looking at long bones. And you can see from the picture here, this is an example of what could be either a femur or a humerus, maybe a tibia, any of the long bones in the body. Okay, you can see that the primary ossification center, this is the first location in the bone where bone starts to form. It usually forms directly in the middle of the shaft, and it starts to form outward in both directions towards the end. Okay, so bone forms in the middle of the bone, of the model, the cartilaginous model, and it starts to extend outward. Okay, so this is the primary ossification center, and then the secondary ossification centers occur at the end of the bone. Okay, so the center of the bone forms first, and then the ends of the bone start to form later on. Okay, and these secondary ossification centers are also called epiphyseal plates, growth plates, or pressure epiphyses. They're the locations that allow us to grow. That's why they're called the growth plates. Okay, so if you look at the picture on the bottom, right here, you can see that, you know, there's the bone, And then we have cartilage here. Let's see. Okay, calcified cartilage. Okay, so yeah, it's been a while since I've seen this picture. Here, let me see if I can see another picture. Okay, so this line here, now there's a lot going on. You know, I don't want to get into this because, I mean, it's like I said, it's been a while since I've seen it. But bottom line is that every bone, at the end of the bone, you could see, and if you look at your bone models from A&P, or even if you pick up a chicken bone, you know, after you eat chicken or whatever, you can see a line at the end of the bone. Okay, that line represents the epiphyses or the growth plate. Okay, so that's the zone that bone has formed at the secondary ossification centers at the end that has allowed the bone to grow in length. Okay, so we do grow in length as we ossify our bones, but then we also grow in girth. This is called appositional bone growth. So this allows our bones to grow in girth, and it becomes wider and thicker and more dense. Okay, this occurs all the way up to through and beyond the teenage years, all the way into the 20s in some cases. So whenever the bone grows in height, we reach our peak height. Whenever the bones grow in girth, we eventually reach our peak weight and our peak function. Okay, this is whenever we approach our maturation. At that point, we are the most functional we'll ever be in our lives. We're like in the best shape we'll ever be. And then from our 20s all the way till through death, I mean, we just gradually lose function, and I mean, it depends on how much we exercise throughout, or how much we engage in physical activity throughout our life. That depends on how fast the decline is. If you're sedentary, you don't exercise at all, don't engage in any kind of physical activity, the decline will happen rather rapidly. But for people who engage in exercise for their entire life, they'll lose strength, they'll lose bone density, they'll lose function, but at a much slower rate than those who are who are sedentary, who don't exercise at all. Okay, but at this point, our bones are the biggest, they're the longest, and they're the thickest they'll ever be, so they can really anchor all type of muscle contractions, because remember, the muscles have to pull on the bones in order for them to contract. So at this point, this is when we reach peak physical function. Here's some other. You can go through these slides. A lot going on with the skeletal system. Really, what I really wanted you to know with development is the ossification centers, primary and secondary ossification centers. So this allows our bodies to, our skeleton, our bones to develop from the cartilaginous model. And then I want you to know that the appositional growth increases the bone girth to the point where our bones will be the thickest they'll ever be. Now, the more we engage in physical activity, the more the bones realize that it needs the calcium or the structural component that allows our bones to stay hard. But the less we engage in physical activity, it starts to give up some of that calcium, and our bone density starts to decrease. To the point where if we don't engage in physical activity, or very much throughout our lives, then we can eventually develop some adverse health conditions, namely osteoporosis. And that's what this is saying here. So we do start to decrease our bone density even right after we mature. It's just that the pace or the rate at which we lose our bone density isn't until later on in life. Okay, so again, important to maintain, to maintain high levels of physical activity. And the reason why we talk about aging, and I try to stay brief with aging in this course, is because you're going to be working with different types of people. I mean, it'd be nice to be able to work with kids and athletes and young adults, but the reality is that there's a large population of elderly individuals in this country. I would say, a large percentage of your client base or your patients will be in the elderly population. So it's important to understand what they've experienced, physically throughout their lifetime, and how they've gotten to the point where they are whenever you start working with them. But you'll learn a lot more about that in your physical aging class. Okay, so the muscular system also starts to develop prenatally before birth. It involves the processes of hyperplasia and hypertrophy. Okay, hyperplasia is the increase in the number of cells. All right, so if you guys remember biology and the process of mitosis, every cell replicates into two identical cells. So whenever the cells, upon development in the fetus, they eventually differentiate into muscle cells or muscle fibers. Those fibers are increasing in size. So that's how we, develop the muscular system. Now, each of those cells then eventually grows in size. That's hypertrophy. So hypertrophy is the growth of individual cells. Hyperplasia is the increase in the number of cells. Hypertrophy is the growth of those cells. Okay. So at birth, muscle cells account for, muscle tissue. Muscle tissue accounts for about a quarter of our body weight. But eventually, as we mature, it'll account for nearly 50% of our body weight, depending if you're a man or a woman. So let's see. So here's a muscle structure. Here's a breakdown of the muscle structure. This is a diagram from the textbook, but I kind of like this one. It gives a lot more details, I think. So you can start with the belly of the muscle. So if you were to open up the skin, this is what you would see. You'd be able to see the muscle belly. If you cut the muscle, you would be able to see these circles. These are the fossicles. And then within the fossicles, there are several muscle fibers. Now this becomes microscopic. You can see muscle fiber if you were to cut the muscle. We see muscle fiber again whenever we eat meat. If you break up the meat, the little individual strands, that's the muscle fiber. Each muscle fiber is then broken down into the myofibrils, and this is the part that we can't see. This is becoming microscopic. The whole point of this diagram is to show you that our muscle is composed of just a breakdown of tissue all the way down to the myofilaments. Okay, so in essence, this is the functional unit of the muscle. Okay. Now the muscle fiber is the functional cell of the fiber of the muscle because it has the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria, and it doesn't have endoplasmic reticulum, it's sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it has all the organelles. It captures all the organelles that a normal cell, a normal living cell would have. So the myofilaments, the functional unit of the muscle, is not a living. It can't survive by itself, but this is the smallest unit. So the muscle itself is comprised of trillions and trillions and trillions of myofilaments, and they work together in a functional unit called a sarcomere. A sarcomere is simply the end of the myofilament functional unit, the myofilament unit. Okay, so it starts, and this is just a good picture right here where you can see the zigzag line. That's one endpoint of a sarcomere, and then the other zigzag line is the other start of a sarcomere. So if you look at this picture here, the start of the zigzag would be here. So this would be the beginning of the sarcomere, and then the other one you can't really see, but you can see that the orange bands that are projecting out of the myofibro. Okay, the orange bands or the smaller bands are the actin, and then the thicker band are is the myosin. So in order for the muscle to work, and this is just a magnified representation of that functional unit. So again, you have the ends of the sarcomere here and here. So the smaller band is actin, and the thicker band is myosin. I believe the pictures, the slides, they changed the colors or switched the colors, but it doesn't matter. The thick band in the middle is myosin. and you can see how myosin has all these heads. So I'm sure you've learned before, but I'll reiterate that in order for a muscle to contract, these myosin heads have to attach to actin. Okay. Now, actin has binding sites that I don't know if I have pictures. I think I do. So it has binding sites where these myosin heads attach. Whenever they attach, they kind of like they grab on and they pull the actin towards the midline, and the two endpoints of the muscle get closer together, and that's really what happens whenever a muscle contracts. Now, one of these sarcomeres doesn't do anything. It requires every single functional unit in the muscle, and like I said, every muscle has trillions and trillions of myofilaments. Each of those have to work together in order for the entire muscle to contract. So that's how the muscle works. Okay. In order for the muscle to contract, obviously it has to the myosin heads have to bind to actin, like I just mentioned. But it also has to receive a message from the brain first. The brain processes, this electrical message saying, okay, bicep, flex, quadriceps, flex, gastrocnemius, flex or contract. And those contractions cause our body segments to move. So what happens at the brain creates the message or generates the message, and it sends that message down a pathway of nerves to eventually the nerves will send or deliver the message to the muscle. Okay, so here's an example or a picture of a basic unit of a nerve. This is a neuron. You can see the dendrites on the left side, and then you have the cell body in the middle, and then an axon, and then eventually you have the synaptic terminal. And that's the direction the message propagates down the neurological pathway. So the dendrites receive messages from either the brain or the spinal cord or a previous neuron. The message is then processed by the cell body and then again propagated down the axon to where it's eventually sent to the next destination, whether it's another neuron or a muscle or a gland, and it's released at the synaptic terminals. Now, when it arrives to the next destination, again, it could be another neuron, or it could be a muscle or a gland. Whenever it arrives to that particular location, it then has to send the message through a space called the synaptic cleft, okay, or just simply the synapse. So in other words, the neuron is not directly attached to the next destination. There's a space there. Now it stays in close relationship, but the point of the matter is there is no direct contact. It has to be release what's called a neurotransmitter. In this case, this neurotransmitter, the ACH, stands for acetylcholine. That's the neurotransmitter that's responsible for muscle contraction. So whenever the neuron releases acetylcholine, the postsynaptic membrane, or the membrane that's beyond the synapse, has the acetylcholine receptors, and then the action potential or the electrical impulse can then be propagated down. In this case, it's the muscle. Okay, so the muscle then goes down the T-tubules, and it passes through or by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and this is where calcium is stored, and the calcium then is released to allow the myosin binding sites myosin heads to attach to the actin binding sites. Okay, so the whole point of this is that in order for a muscle to contract, it has to send a message to the muscle. The muscle then receives the message, and then it activates the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium, and then calcium is sent to the actin, and it opens up the binding sites where myosin heads can attach. Okay, and then myosin heads can attach and pull the ends together, and the whole muscle contracts. Okay, now the reason why I'm telling you all of this is because whenever we age, okay, so this is part of normal development, but like I said, once we reach maturation, peak physical functioning in our early to late 20s, we start to decline in physical function. the more we stay active, that decline is lessened. It's less noticeable, but it's inevitable. Everyone declines. I mean, even if they're master Olympic 90-year-old athletes, even them, they decrease in function, just due to nature, just due to aging. All right, so it happens. But like I said, what eventually happens is that we start to lose our muscular strength. We start to lose our muscular power. And this starts to have an effect on the way we move. Again, even though those who are to remain active throughout their life, they start to lose their ability to maintain their strength, and this starts to impair their function. It starts to impair their mobility. It increases their risk for falls, and it also reduces their ability or decreases their ability to recover from loss of balance, which then again leads to falls. Now, there's a difference in the way that we decrease the strength in our muscles. So whenever we decrease strength due to aging, we're remaining active, but we're inevitably, I can't say it right now. We'll lose strength, and that's inevitable. We can't do anything about it. All right. So the decrease in muscle strength due to aging is called sarcopenia. Okay, so that's whenever our muscles just simply get smaller and we start to lose strength. Now, the decrease in muscle mass due to inactivity or a sedentary lifestyle is known as atrophy. Okay, and we also experience atrophy whenever we, if we break our arm or something and we have to have it in a cast and it's immobile for, a 6-week period or so. Yeah, we can lose some muscle mass then, but typically atrophy is associated with sedentary lifestyle over decades of life. There are particular types of muscle fiber that we develop. We have 3 types: type 1, type 2B, and type 2A. Okay, so type 1, this is slow twitch or considered slow oxidative. All this means slow twitch and slow oxidative. All it means is that these particular muscle fibers contract very slowly. They don't contract with a lot of power or a lot of force, but they are able to sustain that contraction for an extended period of time. Okay, so because of that, these are also known as fatigue resistant. Okay, and these particular muscle fibers are suitable for long distance running or engaging in activities that last a prolonged period of time. Excuse me. So if you're a runner or a distance runner, or if you engage in long duration exercise, it's primarily because this type of muscle fiber is working while you're exercising. Now, the type 2B fast muscle fiber is known as fast twitch or fast glycolytic. All this means is that these types of fibers, this type of muscle fiber contracts very rapidly, very forcefully. Okay, but it can only sustain power at a high intensity or contraction at a high intensity for a short period of time. So this type of muscle fiber is suitable for sprinting or any power events. Okay, now the reason why we discuss the differences between muscle fibers is because those who have and this is genetic. There's no way to determine how much of each type of muscle fiber you have in your body. This is genetically predetermined. So for those individuals who have a high percentage of, let's say, type 2B muscle fiber, those are the ones that are, more capable of becoming like world-class sprinters. I mean, world-class sprinters have almost 100% type 2B muscle fiber. And there's nothing you can do about that. You take one person who has a high percentage of type 2B muscle fiber, and you take a second person who has a low percentage of type 2B muscle fiber, and you put them through the same training regimen for years, and they're doing the exact same thing. The one with a higher percentage of fast twitch muscle fiber is simply just going to get faster. It's going to become better at performing power type activities. And that's just nature. That's just genetic. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay. Likewise, if individuals that have a high percentage of the slow twitch muscle fiber, they're more capable of engaging in long distance or events at a much proficient level than those who have a low percentage of slow twitch muscle fiber. So you look at your world-class marathon runners, the guys that can run 26 miles in an hour and a half. They typically have either all or a high percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers. And again, if you took that person with a high percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers, and then you train them alongside with someone who has a very low percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers, they did the same type of training. Eventually, the person with a high percentage slow twitch muscle fibers is just going to become a better distance or long distance athlete than the other. Okay. Now, really, it's impossible to tell how much muscle fiber you have in your body. There is a way. It's called we can do a muscle biopsy, but it's kind of painful, and it's challenging. It's challenging. It requires in order to perform a biopsy, it requires us to take out a chunk of muscle from your body, and that's just it requires a recovery period, and it's pretty painful, and unless you have to, I really wouldn't do it, but there is a way. Okay, the final type of muscle fiber is the type 2A muscle fiber. This is also called intermediate muscle fiber. Now, this type of muscle fiber has properties of both type 1 and type 2B. Okay, so the advantage of having a high percentage of intermediate muscle fiber is that it can be trained to become more like type 1 or more like type 2B. So in other words, if you have a high percentage of type 2A muscle fibers and you engage in like a sprinter's workout or a training program that's going to become that allows you to become a more proficient sprinter, those type 2A muscle fibers will become more like the fast twitch muscle fibers, so it could actually help you improve your performance. At the same time, if you decided, what, I'm gonna quit the sprinter's workouts and I'm gonna start becoming more of a distance runner, then eventually over time those same muscle fibers will become more like the slow twitch muscle fibers. So the type 2A muscle fibers are they're kind of interchangeable, just depending on what type of training you put them through. But again, there's really no way, unless you perform a biopsy, to determine which type of muscle fiber or the percentages of the muscle fibers you have in your own body. But nonetheless, at least you'll know that there's 3 different types, and I'm sure you'd be able to recognize, if you were working with athletes, you'd recognize those who have a high percentage of fast twitch muscle fibers. Those would be the fast guys. The guys, and you put them through the same workouts, but those that have the high percentage of fast twitch muscle fibers, they're the ones that are going to be, again, the fastest runners on the team. That's just the way it is. That's just nature. Okay. Here's a picture of decline in muscle due to age. Now, I don't think you could see the bottom captions of the picture, but this picture on the left, this is a cross-sectional image of the quadriceps muscle looking from the anterior. From the superior. All right, so this is like if I was to cut somebody's leg in half, I'd be looking down through it as if I was, kind of standing, at head level, looking down to their feet. Okay, so you can see that this image has a lot of muscle and very little fat located around the edges of the leg. Now the second picture, so this is this says down here age 25. So this is a 25-year-old leg. The image on the right, this is a 63-year-old person's leg, and you can see that there's a decrease in muscle mass and an increase in fat mass around the leg. Okay, so this is what happens when we age. Again, it's inevitable. This is going to happen regardless of how much you work out. But if you exercise throughout your lifetime, then the loss of muscle mass is the decline is slower, and the increase in fat mass is also slower. So this, this doesn't happen as quickly. But those who don't exercise at all, by the time they get to 63, they have very little muscle mass and a lot of fat mass. Okay. So this becomes especially important. And again, you're talking about people that you'd be working with. It's going to be hard for them to perform any type of activities that requires them to use muscular strength in their legs. You can see rising from a chair, climbing the steps, climbing stairs, etc. So, again, it's important to understand what's going on. So whenever you start working with people, you're like, okay, this person has been suffering from sarcopenia, or it doesn't seem like they've been working out for the last 20 years or so. So I have to rearrange my training schedule in order to accommodate their ability. Okay, some other reasons why we lose strength with age. We obviously lose muscle mass. We do suffer through changes in the nervous system, so the nervous system doesn't work as efficiently or as effectively as it once did. So those chemical messages or those electrical messages being sent from the brain to the muscles, either they're not being received as quickly as they once used to, or perhaps the let me see if I have a picture. Yeah, the nerve itself is having to send messages to more muscle fibers, which decreases the speed of the firing rate. Okay. In terms of the cardiovascular system, we start to lose. You can see capillarity declines with the aging and sedentary people. So the more we're active, the more blood is sent to the muscles. And upon development, the creation of a new system or new pathways of blood inside the muscles. This is called angiogenesis, where we develop new capillaries, and capillaries was where gas exchange. So you can see the pathway of blood as it leaves the heart. It leaves the heart through a system of arteries, and it travels throughout the bodies to the tissues. Once it arrives at the tissues, it breaks off into arterioles, and then the arterioles eventually lead to the network of capillaries. So whenever there's a capillary bed, there's a network of capillaries inside the muscle tissue, and again, the oxygenated blood goes into the muscle, and at the capillaries is where the blood is released from. The oxygen is released from the cardiovascular system into the cells. The cells use it to produce energy, and then the cells produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct of that energy production. And that carbon dioxide then it leaves the cell and it enters the capillaries. Okay, so at that point, the blood that's in the capillaries that contains carbon dioxide then travels, or they all merge together to form the venules, and then eventually all the venules merge together to send blood back to the heart via the veins. Okay, so in the muscle, the more we're active, the more capillaries we have inside the muscle. So we have more capacity to deliver oxygen to the muscles. Okay, but the less we exercise, then we start to lose that capillarity. We start to decline the number of capillaries inside our muscles, and we can no longer meet the demand for oxygen as well as we used to when we were younger and more fit. So again, you'll be working with lots of elderly people in your life. So these are just things to consider and things to understand in terms of trying to understand their ability levels, and why trying to figure out why can't they do as much as people who are younger. Okay. See, so here are some pictures and some slides on the cardiovascular system. Really, what I want you to know, and I'm sure you've learned from other classes, but just to kind of reiterate, all of the blood in the body, once it's used, and when I say used, once it's deprived of, or whenever it's not deprived, but once the oxygen is stripped from the blood and carbon dioxide is delivered to the blood, all of that blood, and we call this deoxygenated blood because it no longer has oxygen, it arrives in the right atrium of the heart. So the heart itself is a 4-chamber system. You have the 2 atria up top, or plural for atrium is atria, and then you have the 2 ventricles on the bottom. So altogether we have 4 chambers of the heart. That's why we have a 4-chamber 2-pump system. Okay, so all of the deoxygenated blood arrives at the right atrium. So all the blood from the head, neck, and arms arrive via the superior vena cava, and then all the blood from the lower body arrives via the inferior vena cava, and it dumps into the right atrium. And then all the blood that's used up in the heart also dumps into the right atrium. So the right atrium is the place where all the deoxygenated blood arrives from the body. Okay. At the same time, you also have blood coming from the lungs that has just been, the blood has gone to the lungs and has given up carbon dioxide, and that's the carbon dioxide we breathe out with every breath, and then the oxygen we breathe in with every breath has now entered the blood, and I'll explain that system in a second. But nonetheless, in the left atrium is blood arriving from the lungs. Okay, so right atrium, blood arriving from the body. Left atrium, blood arriving from the lungs. Okay, so since the blood is arriving from the lungs, this blood is called oxygenated blood because it's rich in oxygen. Okay, so the right side deoxygenated, the left side oxygenated. Okay, all right. So so whenever these 2 chambers fill at the same time, they then contract. Okay, so whenever those atria contract, it delivers blood from the 2 atria into the 2 ventricles. So the deoxygenated blood from the right atrium is pumped into the right ventricle, and the oxygenated blood from the left atrium is pumped into the left ventricle. So now the 2 ventricles have all the blood. Okay, and then the second contraction occurs. So again, it's a 4-chamber 2-pump system. The second contraction occurs. During the second contraction, the blood from the right ventricle eventually leaves the heart via the pulmonary artery, and this goes to the lungs. And then the blood in the left ventricle, this is oxygenated, it also leaves the heart via the aorta in this case. And this is oxygenated blood that's going to the entire body. Okay, so this is where all the tissues receive its oxygen. Okay. And you can see the pathway there. Okay, so when it arrives in the heart, whenever the deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle arrives at the lungs, this is where it receives the oxygen that we just breathed in. All right, so every breath we take, we breathe in oxygen, and the blue line here, the blue tube here, this is the pulmonary artery. In this case, this is an artery carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart. Eventually, it breaks into the arterioles and then eventually the capillaries, just like in the muscles. Okay, so the carbon dioxide from the capillary is released into the endpoint of the pulmonary system of the lung. Okay, so this is the smallest unit of the lung. This is called an alveolus, or alveolus, singular alveolus, plural alveoli. Okay, these are the air sacs that contain either this is where oxygen is the final destination for oxygen, or this is the first, this is a drop-off point for carbon dioxide. So in this case, the blood that has been carried from the heart delivers carbon dioxide, and then the capillaries also pick up oxygen. Okay, so now the blood has oxygen. That's the red representation. Okay, so all these capillaries converge to form the pulmonary venule, and then the venule eventually forms all the venules form the pulmonary vein, and that pulmonary vein then goes back to the heart and delivers the oxygenated blood to the left atrium. So the whole cycle happens again, and it just keeps going on and on and on. Okay. So normal development, eventually, just like every other system, the cardiovascular system, the function of the cardiovascular system starts to decline. So this definitely affects ability levels among the aging population. And you can see some of the reasons why. Okay, so another system that will affect physical movement is the well, it says here the adipose system, but really it's adipose tissue. Excuse me one second. Now, we've grown up thinking that fat is bad for us, and for the most part it is, but there is some that is needed. Okay, so we do need some fat in our body for, you can see here, for energy storage, insulation, and protection of our vital organs. Okay, fat starts to appear prenatally at about 3 months into development. It increases rapidly all the way until about 6 months of age. So even when we're born, we gain a lot of fat, and then it increases as we age, just not at as quick a rate. Okay. Now, when we reach adolescence, the fat in body fat in girls increases a lot more dramatically than in boys, and simply because that's the childbearing years. So the body is preparing to protect a developing baby. Okay, that's that happens naturally. Okay, fat cells grow through or by hyperplasia and hypertrophy. So remember, hyperplasia is the increase in the number of cells, and hypertrophy is the increase of the size of those cells. Okay, and this obviously varies from individual to individual. Okay, as we age, we both tend to gain fat during adulthood, but it's not necessarily something that's inevitable. Obviously we have control on how much fat we develop. The more active we are, obviously the less fat we'll gain. The more sedentary, obviously the more fat that we'll gain. So again, there's something to keep in mind whenever you start working with older adults. You start to understand, what has happened over the last, 2 or 3 decades of their life. You can tell by simply how much body fat they have. So unfortunately, most of the people that we work with will be at least overweight, because according to statistics, about 70% of our population is overweight. About 35% of our population is obese. So we'll be working with some fairly large people. And again, I mean, there's lots of contributing factors, but really it's an indicator of how active they've been throughout the years. Here's some more pictures of obesity, how it's characterized. It's characterized by the fat accumulation of body fat. Typically, body fat is located just beneath the skin in a layer called the subcutaneous layer. This is a picture of let's say this is like the hip region of an individual. So you can see here's the rectus abdominis, here's the navel, or the belly button, the obliques, here's the pubic region, and here's the muscles of the thigh, and then this would be the hip right here. Okay. And this layer right here is the subcutaneous layer. So we store body fat just below our skin. That's where we start to get softer. We not only are we losing muscle mass and muscle strength and muscle tonus, but we're also gaining body fat. Okay. Now, what is this? How does this fat develop? Okay. So in order to understand that, I'm just going to briefly recap on nutrition and the food that we eat. And I'm sure you understand from nutrition or from nutrition sections of courses that we receive our energy from 3 particular types of nutrients. There are 6 nutrients in the body, but only 3 of them provide us with energy in the form of calories, and that's fat, carbohydrates, and protein. And that's what I have here. So you can see carbohydrates and proteins provide us with 4 calories per gram, whereas fats, and really it's not the numbers that I really want you to know, but I want you to see how fats provide us with twice as much, or even more than twice as much as energy as carbohydrates and proteins. Okay. Now, the only reason this is important to understand or consider is because it's providing us with more opportunity to produce energy, and we produce that energy in the cell. And you can see that all three nutrients, they end up, whenever they enter the cell, they end up at the same location. This is called the electron transport system. If you don't know nutrition or it's been a while, don't worry about it. All I want you to see from this diagram is they all end up in the same spot. Okay. Now, when we look at the cell, they end up in these little organelles called mitochondria. Okay, you know that there's nucleus and endoplasmic reticulum, sarcoplasmic, Golgi apparatus, and then you have the mitochondria. Okay, so all of the organic material in the presence of oxygen enter the cell and go to the mitochondria. So once they're in the mitochondria, there's a cascade of events that occurs that eventually produces what's called ATP, or units of energy. Okay, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Okay, now this is the energy that's used for us to survive and for us to do anything, for us to function. All right, so even to think, it requires energy. If we don't have energy, if we haven't eaten for a couple of days, we lose the ability to think. All right, so even thinking requires energy. But certainly, you know, any type of movement, muscle contractions, you know, engaging in exercise or activities or prolonged, you know, movements, it all requires energy. So this is where we get our energy. So if we're using energy, then it's good because we're burning off energy. That's good. But if we don't burn off that energy, it gets stored here. Okay, so the food we eat, whether it's fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, it doesn't matter. It's just that whenever we eat more fat, we're producing more energy, and that energy is being stored here in the fat cells. And this is how we get bigger. So we eat, we produce energy, but we don't use the energy. It gets stored here. Now, if we use the energy, you know, I mean, what does it mean to use energy? You can see that, you know, several metabolic processes require energy. So if you know, the energy that we produce then goes to the metabolic processes in order for you can see in the top picture, the myosin heads have to attach to actin filaments and then pull the actin filaments. That requires energy. All right. So the more we do that, the more energy we burn. But the less we do that, that energy we're consuming has to go somewhere, and it goes to the fat cells. So that's how people start to gain weight. Okay, you can see some more information on fat cells. I guess the final slides are talking about atherosclerosis, or the development of plaque inside the arteries. You can see that this is a cross-sectional diagram of an artery. So if I was to cut an artery in half and look at it, you know, if I was to peep inside the hole of the artery, this is what it would look like. So a normal, healthy, usually a younger person's artery looks like this, but eventually everybody suffers injuries to the internal lining of the artery. And you know, the more unhealthy you are, the less healthy you are, the more injuries occur. So, you know, even the healthiest of people will suffer from an injury, but they're minimal. Okay. But either way, that injury, the site of the injury, allows for plaque to start building up and inside the artery, and eventually could cause the artery to become occluded or blocked, you know, just depending on what's going on. So in this case, you can see that this is a blood clot. So this is restricting blood flow beyond this point of the artery. So that means that any tissue, any muscle tissue, bone tissue, anything beyond this point is no longer receiving oxygen. And if that part of the body doesn't receive oxygen, it eventually dies, and it has to be amputated. So you know, this is a serious condition. This is you know, if this happens in the heart, it leads to a heart attack. If it happens in the blood supply that leads to the brain, it you know, develops a stroke. So yeah, it's a serious condition. Okay, the last discussion is on the nervous system. I've already explained, you know, the importance of the nervous system in terms of physical function. Obviously, in order for a muscle to contract, it has to have a message from the brain, and that brain is sent through the nervous system. So whenever the nervous system starts to decline, then obviously muscle movement starts to decline as well, and eventually muscular strength, physical ability, the ability to recover, all of that becomes impaired. Okay, you can see some pictures of how it develops. I'm not an expert in brain development or nervous system development. Really, I just want you to understand the basics. Yeah, so either physical inactivity or aging simply. Well, you know what? There is something I want to talk about. Okay, this bottom part here, this bottom line here, it says late in prenatal period, neurons start to fire electrical impulses, first at random, then forming circuits. Okay, so in the next chapter, in chapter 6, we'll start talking about movement. Okay, how at first, okay, so again, let's remember Newell's model of constraints. Okay, so in order for a muscle to contract, it has to, there's several systems that have to be prepared for a muscle to contract. So obviously the muscular system, the skeletal system, and then the nervous system. Okay, now a muscle, it's very challenging for a muscle to contract at first. It just simply doesn't have the structural makeup in order to contract. So when it says here that impulses are fired at random, so the brain, knows genetically I need to start developing the muscles that are eventually going to be responsible for walking, for running, for jumping, for doing anything. At first, that's why a baby can't do anything. Can't move at first because their muscles aren't prepared to even stand, let alone start walking. Okay, so the brain just starts to fire off a random impulse to the muscles responsible for walking, and eventually that muscle contracts, but very randomly. It's not like it's a forceful movement, a purposeful movement. It's just a random twitch. It's just the muscle twitches. Okay. But since that muscle twitched, it required the connection of myosin heads to actin. All right, so that's the first time that myosin heads have ever attached to actin and pulled actin to cause the muscle to contract. But it's not yet prepared to do that forcefully with purpose on a frequent basis just yet. But the brain keeps sending random messages to the muscles, and the more often it happens, the more often the myosin heads are attaching to actin, to where eventually, the actin it's almost like it has a mind of its own. The myosin heads start to realize its purpose in attaching to actin and pulling on it so that the entire muscle can contract. Okay, so that's what this is saying. So whenever our nervous system develops initially, so the neurons are in place and everything, structurally is in place, but in order for it to get going, it fires off a random impulse at first just to get it started, and then eventually, whenever the muscle becomes used to engaging in particular movements, and you notice this, whenever you do something for the very first time, you feel awkward. You don't feel fluid. You don't feel coordinated. You feel you're jerky. Think about the first time you ever tried to skate. Your body's not used to it, and it requires your muscles to interact in a certain series of events. We call that the open kinetic chain. But eventually, those impulses that are responsible for all the muscles that are responsible for those movements, eventually they start to fire at a high rate and in unison and in purpose. It starts to realize that, in order for me to stand up on these skates, These muscles have to be activated at this frequency, and your brain knows that. It remembers it. It'll remember it for the rest of your life. That's why if you learn how to ride a bike when you're a kid and you haven't ridden a bike in 10 years, you can get on a bike right now and ride it just like you did, if yesterday, you were 5 years old yesterday, because your muscles remember that. That's what's happened here. So, at first, the impulses are very random just to get it, just to get your muscles going. The muscle contraction is very random, like it's a twitch, just a twitch. And we'll start to look at this in the next chapter. But eventually, the impulses are purposeful and they're meaningful, and then the muscle is contracting with purpose. Every time it needs to contract, it contracts. Okay, so it can contract on command. Okay, so throughout the best part of our lives, especially at maturation, we are at full physical function, but then we start to decline just like any other system. So what happens with decline? Should discuss it right here. Okay, so it says here, aging involves a loss of neurons, dendrites, synapses, neurotransmitters, and myelin. So in essence, we start to decline, our nervous system starts to decline in function. So this happens as we age. And it says here that exercise promotes improved cognitive function. It also helps to slow the rate of decline. But again, just like every other system, the decline is inevitable. It's going to happen to all of us. I mean, that's just what happens. That's how we age, and eventually that's how we eventually pass away. But you'll learn more about that in physical aging. But in this case, whenever you start working with individuals, and if you get a case study, or if you're working with a particular individual that's trying to improve function, at least you know what has happened neurologically, and you'll be able to to cater a treatment plan or some type of training plan in order to improve function. Okay. All right, so that was a pretty long discussion. I tried to cover as much as I needed, but still there's a lot of information. There's a lot of information I just kind of skipped over. Not that it's any less important, but I did want to make sure that I covered the parts that were most important for this particular section. Okay, so in chapter 6, we'll start talking about the actual movements. All right, that's what motor development is. Everybody develops a particular, forms of movement that are common to all individuals, and that's what we'll talk about in chapter 6. All right, so if you have any questions, let me know. You guys have a good time.